For 3 years, Mireille Sauvé was the woman everyone looked through. Not past, through. Like she was made of glass or smoke, or something that didn't quite register as human, in the hierarchy of St. Dominic's Regional Hospital in Ottawa. She took the night shifts nobody wanted. She cleaned up the messes nobody else would touch. She absorbed the sharp edges of Dr. Hargreaves' temper and the casual cruelty of charge nurse Paulette. No, wait. She absorbed the sharp edges of Dr. Hargreaves' temper without flinching. She restocked the supply carts at 4 a.m. in the humming silence of a ward that had forgotten she existed. And every single morning, when the day staff arrived with their coffees and their gossip and their practiced smiles, Mireille Sauvé put on her coat, gathered her bag, and walked out of the building like a shadow, dissolving in sunlight. Nobody thought to ask where she went. Nobody thought to ask anything about her at all. Until the morning the Royal Canadian Regiment marched through the lobby of St. Dominic's, ignored the hospital administrator completely, and came to a full stop in front of the woman scrubbing dried blood off a supply cart in the hallway. But that came later. First, there was the quiet. St. Dominic's Regional was a mid-sized teaching hospital attached to the University of Ottawa's medical faculty, which meant it ran on a steady fuel of ego, competition, and the particular cruelty of people who had worked very hard to feel important. The trauma unit on the 4th floor was its own ecosystem, sealed off from the rest of the hospital by a pair of heavy steel doors, and a culture that had calcified over decades into something that looked, from the outside, like excellence, and felt, from the inside, like surviving a siege. At the top of that ecosystem sat Dr. Frederick Hargreaves. He was 54, silver-haired, and possessed of the absolute, unshakable conviction that the room became measurably better the moment he entered it. He had performed 1,100 surgeries. He referenced this number the way other men referenced their birthdays, casually, constantly, as though it were simply a fact about the universe. He had a habit of speaking to nurses the way he spoke to his surgical instruments, with the flat, transactional expectation that they would perform exactly as intended and make no sound otherwise. Below Hargreaves in the unofficial ranking was Claudette Arsenault, the charge nurse who had run the 4th floor for 9 years, and guarded that authority with the intensity of someone who understood correctly that it was the only power she was ever going to have in that building. Claudette was efficient, politically intelligent, and completely without mercy for anyone she perceived as weak. She had a gift for identifying exactly which staff members lacked the confidence to push back, and she used that gift the way a person uses a Swiss Army knife, constantly and for every purpose imaginable. Mireille Sauvé had been one of those people from the first week. She was 31, though the particular quality of her stillness, the way she moved through a crowded room without touching anyone, the way she listened to a supervisor's instruction and absorbed it without expression, made her seem ageless in a way that people often mistook for vacancy. She was slight and quiet, and wore her dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked painted on. Her scrubs were always clean, always slightly too large, always a faded shade of teal that had survived too many industrial washes. To Claudette, Mireille was a workhorse with no bite. She was the nurse you sent to the room with the combative patient, the one you assigned to the weekend double shift when 2 people called in sick, the one you could hand a mop and a radio silence and trust to disappear. To Hargreaves, she was simply not a physician and therefore not worth the energy of a complete sentence. There were small things, if anyone had been paying attention. The way Mireille's hands never shook during a code, even when every other nurse on the floor was white-knuckling their way through it. The way she could look at a patient's monitor readout and know, before the numbers triggered any alarm, that something was beginning to tip. Once, during a chaotic Thursday evening when Hargreaves was managing two simultaneous critical cases, Mireille had quietly flagged that a post-op patient in bed 6 was showing early signs of septic shock. Subtle signs, the kind that lived in the gap between the data and the instinct that reads the data. Hargreaves had dismissed her without looking up. 4 hours later, when the patient spiked and crashed, the attending physician who caught it received a commendation at the next department meeting. Mireille restocked the crash cart and went home. At 7 in the morning, she never complained. She never lingered in the break room long enough for anyone to read her expression. She ate her lunch alone in a stairwell on the 3rd floor, where nobody ever went, and she stared at the gray Ottawa sky through the narrow window and ate whatever was in her bag without tasting it. And then she went back. The scar on her right forearm, a long, thick, silvered ridge that curved from her wrist to the inside of her elbow. She kept covered with a white compression sleeve she'd been wearing so long it had become invisible, the way all permanent things eventually do. In the locked drawer of her bedside table at home, inside a small metal box she'd bought at a Canadian Tire in Petawawa 6 years ago, there were 3 things. A citation for bravery signed by the Chief of the Defense Staff, a photograph of 11 people standing in front of a CH-146 Griffin helicopter somewhere in the Kandahar province, all of them squinting into a white, obliterating sun, and a handwritten note in French that she had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft, and the ink had faded to a gentle gray. She was completely content to let the 4th floor believe she was nothing. She had seen what happened to people who were something. She knew exactly what that cost. The night that broke the quiet open began on a Wednesday in February, which is to say it began in the particular misery of an Ottawa winter that had been going on too long. It was -23 with the wind chill, and the emergency department downstairs had been running at 140% capacity since noon. Mireille was 3 hours into a 12-hour overnight shift, managing 5 patients, 2 of whom were on continuous monitoring protocols, when the trauma phone rang. She picked it up on the first ring. 4th floor trauma, Sauvé. The voice on the other end was tight and controlled in the way voices get when the person speaking them is holding panic at arm's length by sheer discipline. We're bringing up a 26-year-old female, active-duty Canadian Armed Forces, Corporal. Motor vehicle collision on the Queensway. Transport truck ran a red at Maitland. Blunt thoracic trauma, suspected aortic injury. GCS of 9 on scene dropping. She coded once in the rig. We got her back. BP is 70 over palp. ETA 90 seconds. Mireille was already moving before the call ended. Wake, Dr. Hargreaves, she told the 2nd floor resident. A 3rd year named Bastien Cote, who was covering overnight and who, to his credit, was still awake. Tell him probable aortic injury, BP in the basement. She's going to need the OR. Page the perfusionist and get me 2 large bore IVs open on the gurney. Massive transfusion protocol, now. Bastien stared at her. In 2 months of overnight shifts, he had never heard Mireille Sauvé speak in a register above conversational. She had never directed him to do anything. She had handed him things and answered his questions and moved around him like water moving around a stone. Now, Bastien, she said, and there was something in her voice that made him move without asking why. The elevator doors opened 40 seconds later, and the paramedics came through them fast. The gurney clattering across the threshold with the particular violence of a situation that had no more time for gentleness. On it was a young woman barely visible beneath the oxygen mask and the trauma dressings, and the two paramedics who were still working on her. Her uniform, CAD-PAT Combats, the Canadian pattern, was cut away at the torso. Dog tags caught the fluorescent light. Mireille's eyes went to the tags. Tremblay, Isabelle M. CPL, CAF. Something moved through Mireille's chest, not sentiment. Something older and colder than sentiment. The specific recognition of a soldier seeing another soldier in a place where soldiers are not supposed to end up. She moved to the head of the gurney. What's her pressure? 62/40 and falling, the paramedic said. She's got a right tension pneumo we decompressed in the field, but she's reaccumulating. Listen to her breath sounds. Mireille already had her stethoscope in her ears. She listened to the right side of Corporal Tremblay's chest. Silence. The left side, present but diminished. She needs a chest tube, Mireille said. That's a physician call, Bastien said. He wasn't being obstructive. He was genuinely uncertain, standing at the foot of the bed with his hands at his sides, looking at a patient who was dying in measurable increments. Where is Hargreaves? Mireille asked. I paged him. He said he'd be here in 5 minutes. The monitor alarmed. The waveform on the screen went ragged, then flat. She's in arrest, one of the paramedics said. Bastien reached for the patient's chest to begin compressions. Don't. Mireille's hand caught his wrist. She retensioned. You compress a tension pneumothorax. You kill her in under a minute. We decompress first. You can't, Mireille. That's a surgical. Hand me the thoracostomy kit. There was a moment, not long, a second, maybe 2, where the room was absolutely still. Bastien looked at the patient. He looked at the monitor. He looked at Mireille's face, which was the face of a person who had made this particular calculation before, in circumstances that made a trauma bay at St. Dominic's look like a quiet afternoon. He handed her the kit. She did it the way you do things you have done many times in the worst possible conditions, without hesitation and without ceremony. The incision was precise. The decompression was immediate. The rush of air and blood into the canister was audible across the room. Mireille guided the tube into the pleural space with both hands, her movements deliberate and unhurried, and when it was seated, she stepped back and looked at the monitor. The line twitched again. A rhythm returned, weak, rapid, but present. Push 2 units, she said, already moving to the IV lines. Get the rapid infuser running, and someone call the OR. She needs a trauma surgeon, and she needs one right now. When Hargreaves arrived 4 minutes later, still in his coat from outside, the color returning to Corporal Tremblay's face, and a chest tube correctly placed and draining, and a massive transfusion protocol already running, he took in the room the way a man takes in a scene he has already missed. He looked at Bastien Coté. Good work, Coté, he said, because Bastien was the physician in the room, and that was simply how Hargreaves's mind organized information. Textbook placement. We'll get her up to OR 3. Bastien opened his mouth. Mireille, who was hanging the 3rd unit of packed red cells, gave him a quiet, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Bastien closed his mouth. Thank you, sir. Hargreaves swept out of the room, already calling the surgical team. Claudette Arsenault, who had arrived somewhere in the middle of all of it, and absorbed the scene with the political antenna of someone who understood instinctively that something important had happened, turned to Mireille as the gurney was wheeled toward the elevator. "You placed that tube," Claudette said. It was not quite an accusation. It was not quite not one either. "She'd have died," Mireille said. "That's not your call to make. Someone had to make it." Claudette held her gaze for a long moment. Then she turned and walked away, and the fourth floor swallowed the moment whole the way institutions swallow inconvenient things, quietly and without trace. Corporal Isabelle Tremblay survived. She spent 4 days in the surgical ICU and then was moved to a step-down unit, where she spent another 11 days recovering from a repaired aortic laceration, 3 fractured ribs, and a collapsed lung that had been, as the thoracic surgeon put it in his notes, decompressants in the field, in the trauma bay, with notable efficiency. The hospital administration, catching wind that a young female soldier had been treated at St. Dominic's, smelled exactly what hospital administrations always smell in situations like that. An opportunity. The director of operations, a man named Gerald Finch, who wore his lanyards with a particular kind of pride, descended on the 4th floor with a communications officer and a photographer. And the news that Corporal Tremblay's regimental family from CFB Petawawa were coming to present her with a service commendation she'd earned before the accident. A ceremony that, with the right framing, could generate exactly the kind of positive media coverage St. Dominic's had been meaning to pursue. Claudette Arsenault rearranged the shift schedule the same afternoon. She ensured she was Corporal Tremblay's primary nurse for the day of the visit. She had her hair done the evening before. She spoke to the communications officer twice and confirmed, both times, the spelling of her name. Mireille Sauvé, who had been Corporal Tremblay's overnight nurse for all 4 nights of her ICU stay and who had spent those nights adjusting her drips and monitoring her chest tube output and sitting once for 11 quiet minutes at the side of her bed when the corporal had woken afraid at 3 a.m. and needed a human being more than she needed medication. Mireille was assigned to supply inventory in the storage corridor on the afternoon of the visit. "The media will be on the floor," Claudette told her, smoothing the front of her own scrubs. "We need the presentation area uncluttered." "You understand." "Of course," Mireille said. She collected her inventory sheets and went. She was in the storage corridor at 1400 hours, counting boxes of IV scalene with a hand scanner when she heard the elevator arrive. She heard the footsteps before she heard anything else. There is a particular quality to the footstep of a person in parade dress and a precision, a weight, a rhythm that is not quite like any civilian gait. Mireille had not heard it in 6 years. Her body recognized it before her mind did, a slow, involuntary straightening of her spine that she didn't notice until it had already happened. She kept counting. She heard Finch's voice from the nursing station down the hall, warm and projecting and slightly too loud. "Warrant Officer Beaumont, welcome to St. Dominic's. We're so proud of the care we've provided Corporal Tremblay. Let me introduce you to our charge nurse, Claudette, who has been absolutely dedicated to." The footsteps stopped in the corridor, near the storage room. Mireille looked up from her scanner. Standing in the doorway was a man she had not seen in 6 years. He was broader now, and the hair at his temples had gone gray, and his dress uniform bore 2 new commendation ribbons she didn't recognize. But his eyes were the same, dark, precise, the eyes of a man trained to see accurately in conditions designed to obscure. Warrant Officer Etienne Beaumont stood in the doorway of the supply corridor of St. Dominic's Regional Hospital and looked at Mireille Sauvé, and for a moment he simply did not move. Then, very slowly, the color left his face entirely. "Sauvé," he said, not a question, a recognition, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than memory. Mireille set the scanner down on a shelf of saline bags. "Beaumont," she said. He crossed the corridor in 3 steps and stopped in front of her. He looked at her the way you look at something you had given up believing still existed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "They told us Kandahar," he said. His voice had the particular roughness of a man who was holding something together by force of will. "The medevac report. They told us you didn't, that you were. I know what they told you. We held a memorial, Sauvé, at Petawawa. The whole unit." "I know." She said it without apology and without deflection. "I wasn't fit to come back. I took a medical release, and I needed it to be clean. I'm sorry for what that cost." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned his head and looked back down the corridor toward the nursing station, where Claudette was still mid-sentence, and Finch was still smiling, and the photographer was still adjusting his lens. Beaumont turned back to Mireille. "How long have you been working here?" 3 years. 3 years. He repeated it in the tone of a man doing arithmetic. He looked at her scrubs, her scanner, the shelf of saline behind her. "As what?" "Floor nurse." Something moved behind his eyes. He straightened. He turned toward the corridor. He lifted his chin. "Section," he said. In the nursing station, the footsteps that had paused resumed, all of them in unison. Gerald Finch was mid-sentence when the soldiers turned. Claudette had her hand extended to shake Beaumont's. The photographer had raised his camera. None of it landed. The soldiers walked past all of it. Past Finch, whose hand stayed in the air. Past Claudette, whose smile became fixed and confused, and then quietly afraid. Past Dr. Hargreaves, who had come down for the occasion, and who stood very still as the men in dress uniform moved past him like he was furniture. They came to a stop in the entrance to the storage corridor. Warrant Officer Beaumont came to a stop 2 feet from Mireille Sauvé. He drew himself up. He raised his right hand in a salute, so precise it looked like something out of a recruiting video, and he held it there. Behind him, every soldier did the same. Mireille stood between a shelf of IV bags and a biohazard bin with a scanner in her hand, and she looked at Etienne Beaumont, and she did not move for a long moment. The mask she had been wearing for 3 years, the slumped shoulders, the downcast gaze, the particular self-erasure of a woman who had decided that invisibility was the price of peace. It didn't fall so much as it simply stopped being necessary. She stood up straight. Her feet went shoulder-width. Her chin came level. She did not return the salute. She was in civilian scrubs, but she gave a single, deliberate nod. "At ease, warrant officer." The soldiers dropped their salutes in unison. Beaumont's composure, which had held through 3 combat deployments, and things Mireille had been there for, and would not think about in a supply corridor in February, showed its first crack. He pressed his lips together. Master Corporal Tremblay said something to her regimental officer when she regained consciousness, Beaumont said, his voice carefully controlled. She said the nurse who sat with her at 3 in the morning had a compression sleeve on her right arm, and spoke to her in Quebecois French and told her the first 24 hours were the worst, and she'd be through it before she knew. She said the nurse knew exactly what she'd been through. He paused. The regimental officer forwarded the note to us. I pulled the staff roster for St. Dominic's 4th floor. He stopped again. Sauvé. You were the lead combat medic for 2 RCR's forward surgical element. You were in Kandahar, Helmand, and Panjwai. You held that surgical station together for 14 months, single-handedly after Captain Morin was killed. His voice dropped. What are you doing counting IV bags? Surviving, Mireille said simply. She said it without self-pity, which made it worse. Down the corridor, Gerald Finch had collected himself enough to start moving forward. He was smiling the smile of a man who has identified a situation he does not understand and has decided to take control of it through sheer administrative confidence. Warrant Officer Beaumont, Finch said, arriving at Beaumont's shoulder, slightly breathless. There seems to have been I think perhaps we got turned around. The ceremony for Corporal Tremblay is set up in the patient suite. If you'll just follow me. Claudette will. Beaumont turned his head. He regarded Gerald Finch with the particular blankness of a man who is deciding whether a thing is worth his attention. You're the administrator? Beaumont said. Director of Operations? Yes, Gerald Finch. Tell me something, mister. Finch. Beaumont's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Are you aware that one of your nursing staff is a decorated veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces with 14 months of forward surgical experience in active combat zones? Finch looked at Mireille. He appeared to be doing some rapid internal recalibration. Nurse Sauvé is. She's a valued member of our. She performed a chest tube insertion 4 nights ago that saved the life of one of my soldiers, Beaumont said. Without which, Corporal Tremblay would have died on your floor. Are you aware of that? Finch's smile lost some structural integrity. There was an incident that is still under review by our risk management. Under review? Beaumont repeated. There are protocols around invasive procedures that non-physician staff. Mr. Finch. Beaumont stepped slightly closer. The Canadian Armed Forces has 7 trauma training contracts with Ottawa area hospitals. St. Dominic's holds 3 of them. I would recommend you finish that sentence very carefully. The corridor was absolutely silent. Claudette, who had followed at a distance, had stopped moving entirely. Dr. Hargreaves, who had positioned himself near the nursing station to maintain a credible proximity to the event, was staring at his own shoes. Finch did not finish the sentence. Beaumont turned back to Mireille. From inside his jacket, he withdrew a small, flat case. He opened it. Inside, on a bed of dark blue velvet, sat a citation. The written commendation that Corporal Tremblay had earned in the field, which had been the original reason for the visit, and which Beaumont had already decided was not the most important commendation in the room. This is Isabelle Tremblay's, he said. We'll give it to her in a moment. He closed the case. He looked at Mireille. I'm going to make some calls this afternoon. The CAF's Civilian Trauma Consultation Program has been looking for a training director for its Ottawa region for 8 months. Someone to work with military and civilian surgical teams, teaching field triage, emergency decompression, austere environment protocols. He paused. I'd like to put your name forward. It pays considerably better than counting saline bags, and you'd keep your nursing registration. You'd just actually be using it. Mireille looked at him for a long moment. I'll think about it, she said. It was not the dramatic acceptance anyone watching might have wanted. But it was honest, which had always been one of the things Etienne Beaumont had respected about her. He nodded once. Then he looked past her, to where Claudette and Hargreaves and Finch were standing in various attitudes of discomfort, and his expression settled into something that was not quite satisfaction, but was close enough to be uncomfortable. Before we go see Corporal Tremblay, Beaumont said, his voice carrying the full length of the corridor. "I'd like to address something. Nurse Sauvé has informed me, in the 6 minutes we've been speaking, that she flagged a patient's early septic indicators 3 months ago and was dismissed without her concern being recorded. She has mentioned that an emergency intervention she performed was credited to another provider. She has not mentioned these things to complain." He looked at Finch. "I mention them because they are the kind of institutional patterns that tend to have consequences. Legal ones, sometimes. Mr. Finch, I'd suggest an internal review of your 4th floor documentation practices might be worthwhile, before anyone else reviews them for you." Finch had gone the color of old putty. Claudette had not moved in some time. Dr. Hargreaves, very quietly, stepped backward until he was no longer visible from the corridor. Mireille said nothing. She had already said everything she needed to say, and she understood, with the calm of someone who had spent years outnumbered and had learned to pick her ground, that the next part was not hers to manage. She set the inventory scanner down on the shelf. She folded her inventory sheet in half and tucked it in her pocket. She walked to the doorway of the supply corridor and stood next to Etienne Beaumont, and together they walked to Corporal Tremblay's room. And the soldiers fell in behind them, and the footsteps went back down the hallway, and this time every head turned. The ceremony for Corporal Tremblay took 12 minutes. She cried when she saw Beaumont. She shook hands with 3 soldiers she hadn't seen since before the accident. She accepted her commendation with her left hand because her right arm was still immobilized, and she held it against her chest and looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way people look at the ceiling when they are not looking at the ceiling. When it was over, when the soldiers had said their goodbyes and Tremblay was resting again, and the room was quiet, she reached out and caught Mireille's hand at the door. "You're the one who stayed," Tremblay said. It was not a question. "I was on nights," Mireille said. Tremblay looked at her. "You told me the first 24 were the worst. That I'd be through it. You were. You sounded like you'd been through something worse." Mireille didn't answer that, but she didn't look away either, and Isabelle Tremblay, who was 26 years old, and who had been through enough to know the difference, understood what the silence meant. "Thank you," Tremblay said. Mireille squeezed her hand once and let it go. In the weeks that followed, the 4th floor of St. Dominic's Regional shifted in the invisible, incremental way that institutions shift when the ground underneath them turns out to be less solid than anyone thought. Gerald Finch commissioned a documentation audit. Claudette Arsenault was placed on a performance improvement plan that nobody described in those terms, but everyone understood. Dr. Hargreaves' prescribing history was reviewed as part of a broader departmental quality process, and 2 of his outstanding malpractice complaints, previously filed and quietly set aside, were reopened. Dr. Bastien Coté, who had handed Mireille the thoracostomy kit at 2 a.m., and had then spent 3 weeks living with what that meant, submitted a written account of the evening to the hospital's patient safety office. It was one of the harder things he had done, and also one of the easier ones, in the way that things are easy once you have decided to stop pretending they didn't happen. Mireille read his account in the staff notification she received on a Tuesday. She sat with it for a moment. Then she closed the email and went back to her shift. She took the position with the CSAF's Civilian Trauma Consultation Program in March. She negotiated the start date herself, and she stayed on at St. Dominic's. Through the transition, because there were patients on the overnight rotation who knew her face and slept better for it, and she was not going to leave them before the handoff was clean. On her last overnight shift, she restocked the crash carts in the East Wing at 4 a.m. the way she always had. She checked the medications in the supply room. She verified the morning charts. She sat for a few minutes in the stairwell on the 3rd floor, the one nobody ever used, and looked at the Ottawa winter through the narrow window. The city was still and dark and covered in snow, and the sky above the downtown core had that particular orange quality that cold cities get at night. Light bouncing off cloud, everything held. She ate the last of a granola bar and did not think about anything in particular. Then she went back to the floor, and she finished the shift, and she walked out of St. Dominic's Regional Hospital for the last time at 7-8 in the morning, into a February cold that had begun, finally, to soften at the edges, and the city was just starting to wake up around her. And she walked to the parking structure and got into her car, and sat there for a moment with her hands in her lap. She had not cried in 6 years. She did not cry now. She started the car, and she drove home through the beginning of a morning that was just barely, almost imperceptibly, starting to get light.